Happy New Year! I'm Mattea Roach, and welcome back to Bookends. If you grew up reading comics in bygone days before the internet, you might remember that there used to be these letters columns for fans at the back of comic books. This used to be the only way for comics readers to get in touch with their favorite creators and to get insight into their work and their process. My guest today, Adrian Tomine, actually started out as one of those kids who was sending letters to his comics heroes and then reading the letters that were published in the back of those books. Now, Adrian is the cartoonist, with a career that spanned decades and has included plenty of awards and public recognition. And now he's the one on the receiving end of lots and lots of questions from his readers. Adrian's latest book, called Q&A, compiles some of the questions he hears the most from his readers and answers those questions with a combination of words, photos, and illustrations. It's a fascinating deep dive into the process of creation and how one lives as a working cartoonist. Adrian Tomine joined me from a studio in New York. Hi, Adrian.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is a novel, partly a graphic novel because there are some images, but there's also photos, there's plenty of text. And it's correspondence between you and your readers that I feel opens up this dialogue between you and the people who enjoy your art that we don't always get to see. And I'm wondering, what do you personally get out of that relationship with your readers, and what makes you want to respond in this really fulsome way?
I think that that relationship that you're talking about has been a pretty important part of my whole career. I started getting feedback through the mail about my comics almost as soon as I started putting them out there into the world. I started doing that when I was a teenager, and I was self-publishing little handmade zines that I would distribute to stores, mostly around Sacramento in California. And I think even after the first one was put up on consignment at a local store, I got some mail at the address that I published in there. And that went on for years. And I think by publishing other people's letters and printing an address in my comic, that just sort of encouraged people to keep doing that. I think, it's hard to describe that experience in the present day because like you said, that was sort of the only path of contact between the artist and the reader. And I'd been very much on the other side of that by sending comics and letters to artists that I admired. So to have people writing to me and asking questions and sending me things, it was gratifying, but also educational, inspirational. If people have read the old comics, they'll know that there was a lot of criticism that came my way that I was happy to publish rather than hide from, and I learned a lot from that, probably more than the praise.
I know you've spoken before in other interviews and also in your memoir, The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist, about sort of this process of trial and error and developing your style and struggling to find proficiency and just make something that you felt good putting out in the world. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that early part of your cartooning journey and how you did develop, as you said, without maybe access to reference material of what does my favorite cartoonist use for pens and paper.
Sometimes I look at where I am now and I can't believe that I've ended up here because I was flailing around so wildly on my own without any kind of guidance. There were no schools, even as I got older, there were no schools or classes for me to take about how to become a cartoonist. Yeah, so a lot of it was trial and error, just scouring the world for any little bit of information, even though I'd sort of eventually moved away from the comics that I grew up reading, like the superhero comics. Those were still the things that had the most reference out there. There was a book about how to draw comics the Marvel way that I held on to for probably much longer than necessary and used as some sort of reference. But in terms of doing the kind of work that was the start of what I'm doing now, a lot of it was trial and error, copying. I mean, again, this is one of those things that I think the taboo around has kind of evaporated a little bit. But I got a lot of criticism for copying other artists and for being imitative, which I am fully aware of. But that was, in a lot of ways, in the absence of actual teachers or anything like that, that was how I learned. And a lot of it was looking at the work of a cartoonist and just really trying to figure out how they made those lines or how they told that story. And for me, a lot of that was through imitation. Yeah, so a lot of my career was spent trying to shake off the vestiges of that. And I'm probably still working on that.
Yeah, I'm curious because you talk in Q&A about some of these influences being really apparent, and there's some very funny moments in, again, your book before that, The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist, of people kind of pointing out some maybe derivativeness in your early work. I think it's natural for artists to look to, regardless of what form they're in, look to people whose work they find inspiring. And maybe some of the early stuff that they produce ends up being a bit too close to what they were inspired by. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about who some of those early influences were. Because from what I understand, some of the people whose work you really admired became not just people that you kind of looked up to, but people that you developed personal relationships with and met later on in the wider community.
I sometimes feel bad talking about this to aspiring cartoonists because this is one of the many elements of my path that you can't just prescribe, and you can't go to a school to have this experience, or you can't buy this experience. But yeah, I did have the opportunity to not just kind of learn from the work of certain cartoonists, but to then get to know them personally. Sometimes it was through just complete coincidence. I described this in the book, but when I moved, when I left home for the first time to go away to college, through pure coincidence, I ended up living in an apartment that was on the same block and about equidistant from two of my favorite cartoonists who I'd already corresponded with when I was younger. And that was Daniel Clowes and Richard Sala. Very shortly after moving there, we were introduced and became friends. And with very few exceptions, we spent every Wednesday for the next 10 years getting together for lunch, going to the comic store, looking at used bookstores, sitting around just talking about comics and our work. And like, those guys were my friends, but they were also very much inspirations. And I mean, they would deny it, but they were mentors for sure to me. And, you know, I think the comics world, even today, is just smaller and more accessible and a little more human than some of these other bigger industries. I mean, an aspiring pop singer could never just do something like that, where they just become friends with their idol and learn from them. But yeah, that was miraculous to me. And there were a lot of other artists who I didn't happen to live on the same block as, but did get to know. And they're all a very modest and self-effacing group. And so I don't think any of them ever felt like they were in some position to sit down and teach me lessons about how to be a cartoonist. But by hanging around them and just like going out to dinner or going, you know, I've often said that you can learn a lot about this art form by just going to an old bookstore or a comic store with other cartoonists and watching what they pick up and what they talk about and their reaction to things. And I just like soak that up for a decade. And I still do that when I get the chance. That's, it's just a real privilege for me, I think.
Yeah, what you're describing, this sort of process of learning through absorption and also being supported by a community in what you're doing, I think is such a beautiful thing to describe. And I think it's certainly, you know, I don't consider myself an artist of any kind, but I certainly feel like when I come to work in this job, I'm using tools and things that I've picked up from all sorts of people who, in most cases, were not trying to teach me anything on purpose, but I just observed the way that they asked questions, the books that they read, and that sort of thing. One thing that I found really interesting when I was reading Q&A, reading some of your previous press and about your journey as a cartoonist is you had parents that actually, I think, encouraged an interest in cartooning and or at least were okay with it at a time where it was, as you mentioned earlier, kind of looked down upon.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a different story than what we often hear of successful artists whose parents are like, art is not serious and you should go do, I don't know, be a lawyer or something. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the impact that relationship with your parents had on your life and career.
Yeah, I think it's just another one of those lucky breaks for me that, again, you can't prescribe to someone. You can't tell an aspiring artist to have these kinds of parents. Especially in hindsight, I see how unusual it was Not just because at the time it seemed preposterous to have a career in comics, or the idea that I was pursuing an art form that was pretty denigrated in American culture at the time, or thought of as just for kids. So all of that was sort of working against me and made my parents' encouragement surprising. But also in hindsight, I think back to the fact that, my parents were both born in incarceration camps during World War II, and were really, as they grew up, they had a lot of pressure to conform and fit in and sort of reintegrate. And I don't know that all of the people of my parents' generation were as encouraging and generous about their children pursuing such a bizarre career path.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that's especially why it stands out as remarkable, is that I know personally so many people that grow up with parents that are of a racial minority background. There's this model minority pressure.
Yeah.
And I think for your parents, that experience of being born in an incarceration camp during Japanese internment, I can imagine that could sort of make you develop in one of a variety of ways as an adult. What do you think it was about your parents' personalities that made them sort of respond to the social and cultural conditions they grew up in by being you know what, actually, we need to let our kid pursue his interests?
It's pretty miraculous. I think, obviously, some of it just has to do with their own personalities and their own love of the arts. Both my dad and my mom just had sort of a inherent love and respect for art and creativity, and sort of made that a given in the homes that I grew up in. I think that came from their parents as well. They had parents who had creative endeavors, who were, in a lot of ways, artists who had to take on jobs, But I also benefited from the fact that my parents were sort of hippies. They met at Berkeley as students in the 60s. And I think that there was just a little bit of that cultural time, the counterculture attitude. Yeah, and I don't think that affected everyone, especially not from their generation and from their background. But for me to be, especially when I was 18, 19 years old, and I was living in Berkeley, and I was making my way towards being an alternative cartoonist, I think that was not preposterous to them because of the life that they had lived since they were born.
Yeah, I loved reading. There was this one answer in Q&A where you were talking about, just trying to give advice. It was one of the very broad advice-y questions. Mm-hmm. And you were talking about incorporating, the process of thinking about somebody who was really impactful for you, who has since passed away, into your work, and drawing inspiration from things that they said. And that was something that so touched me, because I was I had never thought about that before exactly in as direct terms as that. But that's sort of going back to the thing that I was saying earlier. If I feel I, for sure in my work, bring people with me every day. One way in which I think the important people in your life has sort of infused itself into your work is you have this very tongue-in-cheek humor that's in some of the later stuff, but you say that wasn't actually always the case with the work you're producing. And you credit your wife, Sarah, with helping you to infuse some of that humor and personality into your work. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about your relationship with her and how, dating her, marrying her, being with her has changed the stuff that you're putting out.
Yeah, well, I give her full credit to the longevity of my career. I think that I would have, well, not just in my career, but in my life, I would have stayed on a very prescribed path. And in a lot of ways, she broke me out of that. But in terms of my work, I described this in the book, but when I met her, I'd been publishing my work for a number of years, but she was not aware of it. And so we just had been dating for a while before she finally read some of my books. And I remember being very nervous about this moment because I knew it would come eventually. And I remember her closing the book and having this reaction of saying yeah, that was great. I really liked it. And I could tell she was holding back in a way. As she knows, I'm very sensitive to the slightest criticism from people that I respect. So I could tell that she was holding back in some way. And I sort of prodded her. And she said, it's just that, in life, you're so funny. And so I took that as a compliment as a person, but as sort of a devastating criticism of my work. And it sort of opened my eyes to the fact of how reactionary my work and my career had been up to that point of where I was trying to sort of define myself in opposition to other things. And I was very insecure about presenting myself as an alternative cartoonist or an underground cartoonist. And so I was really, in some ways consciously, but in a lot of unconscious ways, sort of resisting a lot of aspects of the comics medium because I thought it would seem too juvenile or too silly or too lightweight or something. And so some of that had to do with aesthetic things like color or just really specific things like motion lines or thought bubbles. But I think it also had to do with the tone. And I was really determined to present myself as literary and artistic and serious, all of which makes me cringe a lot when I think about and go back and look at some of that early work. And so it was really with Sarah's encouragement that I let go of a lot of that posturing.
So, Adrian, this is a scary question for me to ask after I've just said your name, but you start the book by talking about how the pronunciation of your last name has become this battle that you've sort of stopped fighting, and also that technically, according to Japanese standards of pronunciation, you pronounce your own name in a way that Japanese folks in Japan think is wrong. Can you talk about how you came to this realization about name pronunciation? Because I know it's something that people who have commonly mispronounced names have very different feelings about.
Yeah. Well, I'm nervous to do this in an audio medium rather than in a book because I'm afraid I'm going to mess up myself now. But like you said, I know that people do have a lot of different feelings about it. And so I don't want to have my jokey attitude about it diminish, the gravity of other people's response to this issue. Especially in the towns that I grew up. And I think I was already a bit of an anomaly by being one of the few Asian kids in school. And so hearing my name pronounced wrong was just sort of standard. I knew when I heard someone shouting out Tomine that they meant me. So there was never any phase in my life where I was correcting people all the time or getting upset if it was not pronounced right. There's an anecdote in my memoir, The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist, where at an award ceremony, another cartoonist just skips over my name because he makes a joke about he's not even going to try and pronounce that one, and it got a big laugh. And that did offend me. I was I was pretty young at the time, so it kind of hurt my feelings. So in that scenario, something like that, the lack of even trying, I found to be offensive. It was kind of a revelation when I went to Japan for the first time as an adult and met a lot of people who had no idea what I was saying when I introduced myself. They didn't recognize my last name because of my pronunciation, and only when they saw it written on paper did it make sense to them. So I think in a lot of ways I was maybe not as egregiously, but I was guilty of mispronouncing my name. And so I didn't feel like I was on any kind of high horse about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a name that in my mind, it's my own name. I know how to say it, but I definitely grew up with my first name being mispronounced quite a lot. And I think at a certain point, you just kind of throw up your hands sometimes and are like, whatever, man, especially if it's a person that you're not necessarily going to see often.
Right.
One of the other questions that you address early on in your book is this question about materials, which I found really interesting to read about because I do no visual art. So to the extent that I use materials for anything, it's what ballpoint pen am I using for my journal? And you make this point that sometimes limiting yourself to a few basic tools, whether it's the pencils, the pens, the paper, erasers, and things that you use, that has yielded your best and most consistent work. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about what artists can gain when they limit themselves in terms of what tools they use. I was almost reminded of the Brian Eno oblique strategies cards where you put these artificial limitations on. In his case, it's mostly for musicians, but really for any kind of art.
Before I go into this, I do tell people that I feel like the subtitle to this book should have been but that's just my opinion or that's just me, because I don't necessarily know that what has worked for me is going to be best for everyone else. And I don't want to be overly didactic about it. But to speak from my own experience, I, like a lot of other cartoonists, just naturally have a very obsessive, well, probably clinically an OCD type personality. And I found that over time, I became very obsessed and concerned about finding the right tools, using the right tools, doing everything right. And a lot of those things were not only hard to track down, but were also expensive. And so I had that feeling of pressure, like you don't want to screw up because you just paid $5 for this piece of paper, or you paid $50 for this sable hair brush or something like that. So I found that not only was it just costing me a lot of money, but it was also costing me a lot of freedom, and it was creating a lot of inhibition for me. And so I was if there had been like a video camera in the corner of my studio when I was in my 20s, it would have been like, a portrait of mental illness in some ways, because I would be so obsessed with doing everything precisely right. And if I messed up a little bit, it would feel like I had ruined the page and I needed to start over. Again, hopefully people are in better shape than me and they don't go through it to the same level. But for me, when I was working on my book, Killing and Dying, I was making a lot of, I think, similar to what you're talking about Brian Eno, is that I was sort of feeling like I'd done everything in this prescribed way for a number of years. And if I didn't make some changes, I was going to lose my mind, or I was going to stop working because it wasn't fun for me. And so one of those things was to just take all the tools that I'd accumulated over the years and put them in a box and put it away. Sort of as a challenge to myself, I said, okay, this next story that I make, I'm going to do it only using stuff that I can get at the Rite Aid, the pharmacy, and I'm going to go right now and see what they have. And so I went there and I bought a pack of printer paper, a mechanical pencil, and a felt tip pen. And that was it. And I came back and I got to work on the story that I'd been writing in my head that the book is named after. It's a story called Killing and Dying. And, I don't want to say myself that it's my best story, but I did feel like it unlocked something for me, and it entered into a new terrain for me. And a lot of that had to do with working quickly and cheaply. And if something was wrong, just crumpling up one sheet of paper and throwing it in the trash. So that was a real revelation for me. And I don't exclusively work with those tools now, but it was a lesson to me about not getting so precious about what's considered the right tools, and feeling like your artwork will inherently be better if you spend a lot of money on the tools.
It's interesting. We've been talking a bit throughout our conversation about things that have pushed your art into new terrains, that have caused you to grow and develop in different directions. And one thing that you've done that's of interest to me is that you've made a foray into screenwriting in addition to being a cartoonist and graphic novelist. And so I understand this is not the only screenplay you've written, but you did write the screenplay for the film adaptation of your book, Shortcomings. And then that film was directed by Randall Park, who I know from when he was on Fresh Off the Boat, but he's done all sorts of things. I'm wondering what the experience of writing a movie and then seeing that film come to life on the big screen was like, given that you were involved in the process.
It was not like anything I've ever experienced before, to be honest. It felt like such a privilege. It felt like such an exciting opportunity to be able to do that. I mean, I kept having these experiences all the way from the pre-production process to even after the movie was finished, and going out and talking about it, where I kept having this feeling like, I can't believe that I'm getting to do this thing. And it was very invigorating for me. Speaking of Sarah, I think she was very appreciative of the impact it had on me as a person. I've talked about how for the first 15 years of our relationship, she would come home from work and I'd be sitting at the same table that I was at when she left. And I would say, well, I inked a couple panels today, and I'd be in sort of a dour mood. And then she'd have to endure dinner with me while I had nothing to say. And as soon as the process of making the Shortcomings movie commenced, she actually said, who am I married to? Even when things were going terrible, I had a lot to talk about, and I had a lot of feelings about things, and things were constantly changing. But also, it was the first time I'd done anything collaborative, which I know sounds insane to most people listening to this, but to have a career that begins as a hobby, as a childhood hobby, and to have that take over your life for the next 3 decades or whatever, I found myself kind of like peeking my head up from a hole I'd been in and realizing that I'd spent most of my life working in complete solitude. And so going into the process of making the movie, there was a little part of me that hoped that it would be a disaster. Like I kind of wanted it to go so bad that I could say, see, I knew I was right. I've done everything. It's better to work alone. Much to my surprise, I had very much the opposite experience. And as much as I loved writing the screenplay and kind of sitting back and watching it be made, I really loved the collaborative aspects of the experience, from getting to know the actors and, watching it evolve through different edits. And all of that was really, really exciting for me and really inspirational. Even when things were maybe not necessarily going in the direction that I would want, it was sort of a feeling of like, I've had 30 years of doing everything exactly my way. And so something about this is fine for me right now.
I'm wondering if do you feel like there were skills that were transferable from cartooning into these new forms that you've been pursuing later on in your career? Because I've spoken to some cartoonists before who are like, cartoons are very much like cinema. And then I've spoken to other cartoonists who are like, absolutely not. They have nothing to do with each other. I think for me, I look at comics and I think, well, cinema and plays also involve placing objects and characters in relation to one another. And there's writing and there's all these things. So I kind of see them as they're not totally unrelated, although there's all sorts of differences that we pointed out.
Again, this is different from a lot of other cartoonists who kind of from the moment they were born, they knew they only wanted to make comics. And that was like their lifelong pursuit. And I think to an outside observer, it looks like that's been the path. But like when I look back on my childhood, I really fell in love with movies and TV and comics equally at the same time. And it just happened to be the reality that a kid can make his own comics much easier than he can make his own movies. So I think in some ways I sort of latched onto comics at an early age because it was so easy to do it in solitude. If you go back and look at a lot of my comics, it's almost like I was trying to make movies in comics form. I was really trying to capture something about the kind of movies that I like, that feel kind of like a very real glimpse at human interaction and interpersonal relationships. And I think even when I was focused exclusively on making comics, I was as inspired by movies as I was by other things.
Yeah. One thing you've talked about is this sort of compulsive need to create that you've felt throughout your life, whether it's in the form of comics being, as you say, more accessible for young people starting out who want to make art, or whether it's now in the form of these screenplays and plays that you're writing. There's this very funny anecdote in your book where you quote one of your daughters who's like explaining her parents' careers. And she says, "My mom is a doctor who helps people with their feelings, and my dad sits at home and draws pictures of himself."
Right.
Which seems, if you're somebody who likes to draw pictures, a bit like it would be a dream job. Yeah. I'm wondering, now having been publishing comics and publishing creative work for several decades since you were a teenager, is there still a bit of like a surreal feeling that you're now an adult man who has 2 kids and you get to draw cartoons and people pay you for your cartoons?
Yeah, it's surreal, and I feel lucky for it, and I understand that it's a big source of irritation for a lot of people, including the 3 people that I live with. I can't remember the words exactly, but there's another quote from my daughter, that same daughter, in the book where she says, she was having a tantrum about having to get dressed and go to school. And she said something about how, like, well, all you have to do is stay home and draw pictures and eat soup in front of the TV or something like that. And it was like this outrageous injustice that she had to get dressed and go to school. It's not lost on me. If that makes things any better, I will say it's not lost on me. But, to be fair, I will also say that there's been many times in my life where you have that feeling of be careful what you wish for, because there were a lot of times when I was younger where I was like, I just want to be left alone to sit in my room and draw comics. And then there are definitely some lonely days where you wish that had not come true. I try to talk about that a little bit in the book. And I have a friend who actually, they're not a cartoonist, but they were interested in trying their hand at cartooning. And a lot of what I talked about was not the physical hands-on stuff about how to make a comics page, but more about what it means to your life. And like, are you prepared for what it means psychologically to sit at a desk, working on trying to tell a story, and the story that you're telling might only take place over the course of a day, but the creation of it might take you years, something like that. I don't know if everybody knows what they're in for when they think, oh, it'd be fun to be a professional cartoonist.
Adrian, thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for having me. It was great to be here.
Adrian Tomine is the author of Q&A and The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist. He joined me from New York. This episode was produced by Ashley July with help from Eileen Yamamoto. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to shout out our hardworking audio techs and the rest of the CBC Books team, who make it all come together for us every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio, or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.